On today's episode of the Bridgehead Briefing, transgender propagandists in Canada are terrified that the Canadian government is actually cracking down on gender. Then we see an actual crackdown in a truly insane story. A women's rights activist had to flee from Brazil and was granted political asylum in Europe after facing a 25-year prison sentence for misgendering. And finally, we look at Canada's two-tier justice system and how right-coded crimes are given far harsher penalties than left-coded crimes, and what that means for Canadians. In one of the funniest stories I have read in Canadian media all year, CTV has outdone itself in its coverage of the transgender issue. So we're going to walk through this story because I really do think that everybody should enjoy this story together. It is sort of like End of Civilization, haha, but the haha is definitely still there. The title is Sign of Concern. Lawyers sound alarms after Canada updates its Nexus card gender policy. Now, if you're the sort of person who, like me, worries a lot about Nexus card gender policy, then this is a story you definitely need to be paying attention to. And the lead paragraph here, I think, is a masterclass in Pravda-level propaganda. It's so unbelievably Orwellian that you actually just have to admire it. Here's the lead paragraph. Immigration lawyers are sounding off alarms, I think they meant sounding alarms, over Canada's decision to strong-arm people into choosing either male or female when applying for or renewing their Nexus travel cards, raising potential constitutional challenges. The decision means non-binary or transgender Canadians crossing the border into the US can no longer choose the X marker. So Canada's decision to strong-arm people into choosing either male or female. This is what's known as like a funnel paragraph, is they're pouring a whole bunch of words into a set of ideological premises, and the conclusion you're supposed to reach when you come out the bottom of the paragraph is like transphobia, and the whole story makes no attempt to be even remotely objective. And this is all the more shocking in the context of the fact that the UK Supreme Court, so the UK, sort of like the mother country of the Commonwealth, ruled that for the purposes of the Equality Act, when the government says woman, they mean biological woman, which is to say woman, like have affirmed that the thing we always knew was true was in fact true. But here in Canada, this sort of very minor change is sounding off alarm bells over Canada's decision. So the move comes on the heels of US President Donald Trump's executive order, because nothing that happens in this country ever has anything to do with Canadians. It's always the MAGA invasion, which states that the US government will only recognize the male and female sex, as opposed to all of the other ones, terminating any US passports and identity documents issued with an X gender marker. So there's a couple of translating terms. I find that these days, to kind of just do commentary and give summaries of the news, half the job is just reading the Canadian mainstream press and then translating it for normal people. Like, here's the kind of Pravda propaganda they're producing, and here's what they actually mean. So for those of you who have never heard the term non-binary, it doesn't have like a specific identification, but it refers to people who refuse to identify as either male or female. So somebody who identifies as transgender would be a woman who identifies as a man, or a man who identifies as a woman. A non-binary person says, I'm neither of those things, which actually kind of contradicts the fundamental premise of transgender, but we don't expect CTV to make any sense, or Canadian policy for that matter. But now the alarms are being sounded because amidst all of this confusion, there's clearly a dark threat looming on the horizon, and we're going to find out about that. But according to Luke Reamer, a spokesperson for Canada Border Services Agency, Nexus cardholders who had their card issued before the executive order took effect will not be impacted, and their membership will remain valid without any change. I do find it kind of interesting that somebody with a transgender or non-binary identity card is worried about changing their documents, which is something that they're usually pretty enthusiastic about. New applicants and existing members renewing their membership are able to apply using a passport with the X gender identifier. However, they will be required to select male or female for the purposes of their Nexus membership, Reamer said in a statement to CTV News. So in other words, you're allowed to, like, if you're in Canada, you can make up whatever you want. But if you want to travel elsewhere, they're going to have to get you to tell us, are you a male non-binary or are you a female non-binary? It's just important for us to know for the purposes of accuracy. Now, this, of course, is the sort of thing that makes Canadian LGBT activists who have basically run the country for the last decade panic, because they don't have anything like any genuine problems that they're worried about. So kind of like when they turned Sean Foyt, a very anodyne praise and worship singer, into sort of the Goldilocks fundamentalist threatening the safety of all Canadians everywhere, even though the entire thing wasn't a big deal. This, of course, is a major culture war. So I think I'm pronouncing her name, Joyce-Na Kang from the Batista Migration Law Group based out of Toronto, calls the move cowardly. It's dictating the complete erasure of non-binary identities from a Canadian legal perspective, and it also raises constitutionality concerns, Kang told CTV News. She said the new policy separates and discriminates against a certain group of people, going against Section 15 of the Canadian Charter, which guarantees equal treatment for everyone under the law. When they drafted the Canadian Charter, they were definitely worried about people who identify as neither male nor female being able to identify as neither male nor female on government documents. This is just another example of how gender ideology, trans activists basically claim that their rights are fundamentally recognized and that their delusions are fundamentally affirmed across the board by all of society. And they do this for a variety of reasons. But their ideology is a fundamental rupture with everything in society that came before, because they are reorganizing every aspect of society around their identity claims and around their new ideology that says not only can a man become a woman and a woman can become a man, but you can also be non-binary or gender fluid. So you can be traveling all over the spectrum, you just apparently can't be traveling back and forth between Canada and the United States. Despite Canada and the U.S. sharing management of the Nexus program, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection oversees the operations of the application process, and the policy was implemented in February 2025. So here's where we get to the sign of concern. So they're cowards because they're demanding that. So if you're in Canada, your documents can say whatever they want. But if you're going elsewhere, you have to let them know if you're a man or a woman. Like it's kind of, you're only allowed to play act on one side of the border. Sarah McHale from the Toronto-based Smith immigration law firm, which specializes in LGBTQ2S+, immigration law, says the policy is invasive. This is for somebody traveling across the border, by the way. So yeah, make of that what you will. The fact that the Canadian government is going forward with this is a sign of concern about what else could happen in the future. I agree, but for all different reasons, McHale told CTV. She pointed out that non-binary and trans people can still apply for a Canadian passport with a non-binary gender designation. What's a non-binary gender designation when you're rejecting both of the genders? Like even their sentences don't have to make any sense anymore because we're all kind of going along with this. However, it could be a serious problem if the Nexus card contains a different gender designation or lack thereof. It's a no gender designation actually from the passport, and the identity documents are inconsistent at the Canada-US border. So here's McHale's next statement. Unfortunately, it does look like there's a very difficult decision to be made about whether they want to continue with the Nexus program and choose a gender designation that's binary, male or female, or just opt out of the program altogether, kind of like how they opted out of male and female altogether. Furthermore, the CBSA has stated that Canada's recognition of the X-gender identifier cannot guarantee entry or transit for Canadians in other countries. In other words, there was a documentary put out by The Telegraph a couple of years ago, and they were talking about how Canada and Ireland that are kind of like the model woke countries. And there's a lot of other countries who have grown up and were like, that's enough, guys. So we did this for 10 years. Turns out it's mostly pretty insane. We're not going to do it anymore. And the Canadians are like, no, this is like a fundamental part of who we are or who we're not or the both genders that we're not. But anyways, we're going to keep on doing this. And other countries are saying, all right, that's fine. You can keep on doing that, but you're only allowed to do that over at your house. You can't do it when you come over at my house. And Canadians are like, well, this is clearly invasive as they try to invade other countries with their ideology. According to the statement, each country has a different value and legal system than the one in Canada, and Canadian travelers are subject to following the local laws of the destination country. That is so transphobic. The idea that each country has a different value and legal system than Canada, and that Canadian travelers are subject to the laws of the country they want to go into. Unbelievable. Hard to, I'm literally shaking. It is important for travelers to be informed about the legal framework and social customs governing sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics in the destination country, which is kind of like a long way of saying diversity is our strength, right? Different people have different social customs, and diversity is our strength. And when you cross the border to a different country, you're going to have to recognize the diversity of opinion and identity and social customs, and you're going to have to essentially perform as demanded by law. Approximately 550 Nexus applications with an X-gender identifier have been submitted to the CBSA between January 22 and March 2025. This is almost as good as the opening paragraph. Both the lawyers, because they found two, you can always find a couple of people to raise the alarm, sounding the alarms, as the opening paragraph said. Both the lawyers are anticipating a wave of fear and concern from non-binary and trans clients about traveling to the US amid these new restrictions. Keep in mind that the X marker on gender on documents is only a couple of years old. And so it gets put on these, now there's an X option, or my favorite one on Canadian documents that I've seen multiple times, like getting my new license, is like prefer not to say. Which is like, so apparently you could just opt out of the whole process altogether. It's like, are you male or female or not? I'm not telling. That's my choice. I'm just not going to share that information with you for all kinds of reasons that I also don't have to disclose. So this has only been around for a couple of years. It's now creating international problems, which again, it's kind of like end of civilization funny, but it is funny because Canada has become fundamentally ridiculous and is recognized by ridiculous. Yet the most ridiculous people in the country are the ones tracked down faithfully by journalists to get their opinions on these things. And these people are treated as if they are serious people, and they're fundamentally unserious people, as recognized by the US Supreme Court, the United Kingdom Supreme Court, and the laws of nations right across the West. But Kang wants to let you know that this wave of fear that we're anticipating, it makes you question what other encroachments on our rights our government is going to be willing to concede when they're faced with pressure from the US. So according to Kang, just to get the legal stuff correct here, Canadians have the right to identify as neither male nor female in a different country. So keep in mind the Canadian government saying if you're in Canada, you can say you are whoever you want. You can even prefer not to say, and the Canadian government's going to be fine with that. But the United States is a different country, a saner country. They still recognize the basic binary. There's male and there's female, and you don't just get to pretend you're something else entirely. There isn't 72 genders, there's 2 of them, but it's a encroachment on the rights of non-binary people to be recognized the way they identify by Americans. That's a Canadian right. It's a brand new right, which is not surprising because this whole thing is based on brand new rights. But the right to be recognized as non-binary by Americans in America, and that it's our government's responsibility to do that by invading them, is really fun. It's fun is the only way to put it, really. She cautions that going forward, people should be aware of their rights and potentially consult an immigration professional before traveling to the U.S., presumably contacting his firm, her firm, where for a very small fee, I'm sure they'll give you all the advice you need. Meanwhile, this is the closing line. Meanwhile, no travel advisories to the U.S. have been announced by the Canadian government. So all of the previous paragraphs, notwithstanding the wave of fear, despite the fact that the Canadian government is Canada's decision to strong-arm people into choosing neither male nor female, yet, despite all of that, no travel advisories to the U.S. have been announced by the Canadian government. It's almost like people could just grow up and pick male or female and travel to the U.S., and that Canadians don't have the right to be recognized however they want by Americans. But anyways, there's just a lot to this story. But the real story is, look at the Canadian press has been so completely captured by gender ideologues that if you read this story, you would actually think that you're traveling across the border into Nazi Germany. But the reality is it's just the States. The reality is that America has the same policy as the United Kingdom, which, as you might know, shares a king with us. But here we are. I hope that you're as concerned as everybody else is, because just to reemphasize, no travel advisories have been announced by the Canadian government to the United States, which is almost like it's not a big deal and there's no real problem here. In one of the craziest stories about the transgender culture war that I have read in years, a Brazilian woman is facing 25 years in prison for the so-called crime of misgendering. a sentence so onerous that she has been accepted as a political refugee in Europe. She has been given asylum in Europe. They recognize that she faces political persecution. Europe, as any listeners or viewers of the Bridgehead will know, has not been great on the transgender issue for the most part. But even they recognize that this is a truly insane thing that's happening. So to give you a summary, I'm going to use the reporting from Redux here. And the reason I mentioned the place that I'm getting the reporting from is because they've done a phenomenal job breaking these stories before anybody else does, as they kind of track what's going on in all these individual countries and the political persecution being leveled against anybody who doesn't believe in gender ideology. And so their lead paragraph is pretty stunning. In a precedent-setting move, a European country has officially granted full refugee protections to a Brazilian women's rights activist who was facing 25 years in jail in her home country for misgendering a transgender politician. Interesting. So trans-identifying politician. This is a man who identifies as a woman. Isabel Sipa is the first person to be recognized as a victim of state persecution for her outspoken opposition to gender identity ideology. I want to pause here a minute. Like 10 or 12 years ago, most of this stuff was foreign to most people. Most people didn't know what the basic premises of gender ideology was. Most people weren't aware of what transgenderism was all about. Fast forward just a few years, and you have somebody from Brazil fleeing to Europe and being formally recognized as a victim of state persecution because she's facing a potential sentence of a quarter century behind bars for referring to a trans-identifying male as male. Wild. That basically means that I could face 25 years in prison in Brazil for correctly identifying the gender of the politician we're about to tell you about. So as previously reported by Redux, Sipa first came under criminal investigation after she made a social media post about Erica Hilton, a male politician who identifies as female. Hilton was elected to the Sao Paulo municipal government in November of 2020, and he won his seat by a landslide and began referring to himself as the most voted for woman in Brazil. So this is something else to note about trans activists. They claim to want to just be able to get on with their lives, right? I'm a male who identifies as a woman. Just leave me alone and let me live my life. That is absolutely not what is actually going on. Trans activists want to force everybody else to affirm their identity. They do so very publicly, and they put themselves in situations where they can actually prosecute, persecute, and force people to affirm their chosen identity. So Redux says, at the time of his victory, Hilton was celebrated in international media as being a symbolic triumph for transgender people. Hilton was among the 10 most top voted for candidates in all of Brazil and was touted as the only woman to make the list. It was the widespread announcement of his victory that first put him on Sipa's radar. And so here's what she said during a 2022 interview. At the time, I didn't even know who this person was. I just saw a headline on an Instagram page celebrating the most voted woman in Sao Paulo as a trans woman. I began to share a video with my followers saying I was disappointed to hear that the most voted for woman in Sao Paulo later found out that it was in the entire country was actually a man. So then Hilton later reported Sipa, who's an outspoken women's rights activist, to the police, and this prompted a criminal investigation. So you have a women's rights activist referring to a man who identifies as a woman, as a man, and then the cops get called, and the cops investigate this as a crime. And then in January of 2022, they summoned her to the police station to interrogate her about this. And that's when she learned that Hilton had actually filed a criminal complaint against her for her social media posts. Again, 10 years ago, we would have considered this stuff to be a kind of a right-wing fantasy version of The Handmaid's Tale, but it's actually happening. After speaking with the police, she was unaware of any further developments in the case until June 2022. And then there was a reporter from a major Brazilian newspaper who contacted her for her comment on charges that were being pressed against her. And she found out from this media article that she was being charged with 5 counts of social racism. That charge, just for context, stems from a 2019 decision by the Supreme Court of Brazil by the Brazil's Supreme Federal Court is what it's called in Brazil, which ruled that discrimination against the LGBTQ community constitutes a penal offense, and that this fell under the race-based protections as a form of racism. So, referring to a man who identifies as a woman as a man is now in the category of racist, specifically social racism. Now, the public prosecutor actually went hunting for details that he could use to charge this woman for social racism. And so the public prosecutor actually combed through her social media to find additional statements that could be perceived as transphobic. And again, transphobia, which is disagreeing with gender ideology and publicly objecting to its premises, is now considered social racism and is a punishable crime in Brazil. And it's from the news article that SIPA discovered she was facing up to 25 years in jail for this alleged crime. Now, what did she do? Well, she fled the country. In July of 2024, she was stopped at the Salvador Bahia airport while attempting to travel to Spain to visit a friend. Federal agents flagged an alert to her passport. So she wanted to leave the country on vacation to visit a friend in Spain while she was being charged with 5 counts of social racism and facing up to 25 years in prison for calling a trans-identifying male male. And they pulled her aside when she was trying to leave the country for further inspection. Unbelievable stuff. During the subsequent interview, authorities determined that her situation could meet the criteria for political persecution, and so they contacted the airline she had booked with and instructed them not to depart without her on board. So they proactively recognized that what she was going through could potentially result in her receiving political asylum. And an officer escorted her onto the plane and advised her against returning to Brazil. So it wasn't even her idea to seek refugee status. She was advised to seek refugee status. I've been covering this issue for about 10 years, and some of these stories, it's still mind-blowing to me that we're watching them unfold in real time. That you've got, federal agents from Spain meeting with a women's rights activist, advising her to get on the plane, accompanying her onto the plane like she's somebody trying to leave Iran or something like that, and then advising her, don't return to Brazil. You might get locked up for a quarter of a century for calling a man a man. In June 2025, following their advice, she formally applied for refugee status. And Redux has now confirmed that SIPA has successfully obtained refugee status with the assistance of the European Union Agency for Asylum, making her the first Brazilian citizen to receive this designation for state persecution since 1985. And why? Because she called a man a man. Redux is withholding the name of the official host country to protect SIPA's privacy. So we know her point of entry was, but we don't know which country has given her formal refugee status. It could be any number of countries. Poland would probably give it to her. Hungary would probably give it to her. But this is so egregious. Again, Spain right now has a very left-wing government, but it was a Spanish federal agent who advised her to seek refugee status. So speaking to Redux, Matria Brazil, a women's rights organization, welcomed the decision, but understandably voiced frustration with the Brazilian government. So you can be glad that this woman is safe, but she essentially cannot go back to her home country because she could face 25 years in jail for calling a male politician male. Their statement was, Matria has been following Isabella SIPA's persecution from the very beginning. Together we exhausted every institutional avenue available within Brazil, always respecting the country's laws and sovereignty, including taking her to a meeting with then Minister for Women, Cida Goncalves, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, so she could present her case in person. The minister showed no concern for her and took no action to protect a Brazilian woman facing political persecution. No other official channel offered any support either. This is crazy. It really is crazy. It, by the way, shows what can happen in a very short amount of time when you elect a left-wing government. So we see the same thing unfolding in other South American countries. They've got conservative governments that kind of reflect the conservative views on life and family that most of the population does. You even have a lot of sort of economically liberal or left-wing politicians running on socially conservative platforms because they recognize that the vast majority of the population is socially conservative. All it takes is one left-wing government and all of that gets turned on its head. So Maitreya said SEPA was left with no choice but to resort to the last and most extreme measure, seeking political asylum abroad. Maitreya drafted a formal letter in support of her application describing the threats she faced in Brazil. For her safety, we do not have further details, but we can now confirm she is safe in a European country. This is a young woman who is a refugee from state persecution on behalf of trans activists that now has to live on a different continent for fear of persecution in her home country. And Maitreya emphasized the broader significance of the case, noting that it marks the first time an individual has been recognized as facing persecution for their criticism of gender ideology. SEPA is the first Brazilian since the end of our military dictatorship to be granted political asylum on the grounds of state persecution, and the first woman in the world to receive this status for being targeted over her dissent on trans ideology. This is a reality many women face across the globe. It is deeply troubling that in our own country, democracy, freedom of belief, and the freedom of speech appear to no longer apply. Many women, not only Isabella, are being harassed and silenced simply for speaking the truth, that sex matters, and that men cannot become woman by an act of will. Her refugee bid is the first successful bid of the kind, but it will now set a precedent for other individuals facing legal and social repercussions for their gender-critical beliefs. It will now be used as a case of reference by any person in the world facing the same kind of persecution. As previously reported on by Redux, and I've been covering this as well, there's been multiple Brazilians facing criminal charges for statements or commentary deemed transphobic, all under the same 2019 Brazil Federal Supreme Court decision that dubs any transphobia as a form of social racism. Earlier this year, women's rights activist Karen Mizuno revealed she had also been notified by the police that she may face criminal charges after mocking a trans activist who claimed that archaeologists are transphobic for correctly identifying people they dig up as male or female. Like, this would be funny, except for the fact that people are actually being prosecuted and put in prison for this stuff. She faces up to 3 years in jail, and in another ongoing case, 2 staff members from the Federal University of Paraíba are fighting criminal charges for allegedly misgendering a transgender student. One of the 2 people being charged was a female janitor who asked an obviously male, a guy in a dress, to leave the female bathroom. So it's hard not to laugh at aspects of the story, except for the fact that you have people being driven out of their country and cannot return to their home country, where their friends and their family are, and where they've lived their whole lives, where they've been raised, where their actual culture is. It's one thing to say, well, I'm glad she's safe in Hungary, Poland, or whatever European country granted her asylum. It's another thing to think that, she is now in a very different country with a very different culture, and she cannot return to Brazil because she might go to jail for a quarter of a century. Everything those of us who warn about transgender totalitarianism have been saying is not only true, but it's worse than we thought it would be. 25 years for misgendering, I've got to say, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of cases like this happening on a smaller scale in the UK, veterans arrested for social media posts, a Scottish construction worker fined massively by a Scottish court for laughing at a man in a dress. We've seen cases like that. This really is gulag level crackdown stuff. And all of us should be paying attention to these stories very, very carefully. Canada's justice system is becoming a 2-tier justice system, with sentences for those guilty of right-coded crimes versus those guilty of left-coded crimes being wildly different. And Chris Selly drew attention to this on the National Post recently, providing what I think is probably the most egregious side-by-side comparison we've seen yet. Those of you who follow the Freedom Convoy story, when thousands of protesters descended on the Canadian capital in early 2022, stayed there for weeks in protest of COVID mandates and the curtailing of Canadian freedoms throughout the pandemic, will know that Tamara Lich has been on trial for some time for her role in organizing the Freedom Convoy. She's only been convicted of mischief, But the Crown prosecutor is recommending 7 years in prison for mischief. Now, a fair-minded observer might say, well, okay, what kind of sentences do people get for other crimes? Maybe Canada's just really, really strict. Maybe Canada cracks down on crime. They got a tough on crime perspective. And the precise opposite of that is the case. People get sentences that are unbelievably lenient for all kinds of crimes. And Chris Selle lays this out really, really well. So it's not just Tamara Lich, it's also Chris Barber, another Freedom Convoy organizer, and both of them are facing a 7-year sentence. That's what the public prosecutor is requesting. We don't know what they're going to get. Hopefully that's not the sentence they get, but that's what's being asked for, because the public prosecutor is sending a message to all Canadians. If you protest the government, if you try to interfere with what the government's doing, we're going to crack down on you as hard as we possibly get. It's a strikingly harsh request. And so Chris Selle notes that they're obviously trying to go scorched earth. And Pierre Poilievre, the federal conservative leader, responded by saying, while rampant violent offenders are released hours after their most recent charges, and anti-Semitic rioters vandalize businesses, terrorize daycares, and block traffic without consequences, the Crown wants 7 years prison time for the charge of mischief for Lich and Barber. Now, Melissa Lantsman, who is another conservative MP and one of Pierre Poilievre's attack dogs, took it a step further. She basically called the sentence request a form of political vengeance from the public prosecutor, and she claimed that the Crown is basically following orders from Ottawa. I think she's probably right about that. We have to be careful about the accusations that we make. Does Canada have an independent judiciary? Well, Canada's judiciary has been appointed by Liberals for a long time. They're overwhelmingly progressive. And as we saw throughout the Freedom Convoy and throughout the pandemic, the courts were very unwilling to buck the Trudeau government in almost any circumstance, with the exception of actually labeling the declaration of the Emergency Measures Act the violation of Canada's constitutional rights, which is the one time the court kind of distinctly stepped away from the general thrust of the Trudeau Liberal government. And so let's take a look at some of the comparisons here that Selle lays out, because really in contrast, it's striking. So here's what Selle writes. Just last week, another notable convicted criminal recently got a sentence of 7 years. So what did he get sentenced for? His name is Jamal Joshua Malik Wheeler, whose criminal record in July 2023 included 3 attacks on total strangers in Edmonton's public transit system. He mugged one transit rider using an axe. That got him 14 months. He punched another, sending him onto the LRT tracks. That's another. And then he sprayed 3 others with bear spray. He was out on bail, conditions of which included staying away from public transit property. Then he fatally stabbed a 52-year-old father of 6, a total stranger. He was originally charged with second-degree murder, but allowed to plead guilty to manslaughter, which is ludicrous. And that's the sentence he got, 7 years. So Tamara Lich and Chris Barber are being asked for 7 years, basically for a rowdy protest that was notable for the total lack of violence. I went and visited the Freedom Convoy myself. Despite predictions of violence all the way through, there was no violence at the Freedom Convoy. There was no clashes with the police that involved violence. And I think it's remarkable that a protest of that size and that intensity resulted in no violence. Here you've got a guy who's mugging people with axes, chucking people onto train tracks, and murdered a father of 6. And the Crown prosecutor is asking for 7 years. Just insane. And then on Monday, the Crown defense and judge in a Quebec courtroom coughed up an absolute Hall of Fame sentence, says Selle. In October 2014, a Canadian woman decamped for Turkey and then Syria and signed up with the nice folks at ISIL, better known, of course, as ISIS, the head-chopping, raping terrorist group that trafficked thousands of Yazidi and Christian women and non-Islamic women into sex slavery. She married a fellow traveler, had 2 kids, and then in 2017 was captured and imprisoned by Syrian Democratic Forces. Canada brought her home in 2022. She pleaded guilty to participating in a terrorist group's activities, not just any terrorist group, ISIS, which carries a sentence of up to 10 years. Her sentence, no word of a lie, 1 day. 1 day plus 3 years probation. Here's what the Director of Public Prosecutions, George Dohally, said. The recommended sentence here takes into consideration the early, ongoing, demonstrated, and independently evaluated steps Joy has taken to demonstrate remorse, take responsibility, and commit to fundamental change and a rejection of extremist ideology. This addresses the ultimate goal of protecting the community. But it's just true that the Canadian government treats Islamic extremism far more kindly than the kinds of ideological extremism that they believe Tamara Lich and Chris Barber were guilty of. According to the Canadian establishment, the Laurentian elites, right-coded crimes are extremist. They're ideological. We need an all-hands-on-deck approach to cracking down. So whether it's the Freedom Convoy, whether it's pro-life protesters, whether it's a sort of windy Goldilocks guy, Sean Foyt, who comes across to sing some anodyne worship songs and immediately becomes a harbinger of fundamentalism in Canada. That guy needs an all-hands-on-deck approach. We need to cancel his public venues. We need the cops to show up at a Montreal church where he's singing. But an imam traveling across the country, known for promoting Islamism, known for his anti-Semitism, the press doesn't even report on this stuff. And this was going on at the same time as a guy who's singing, frankly boring songs. They're not my cup of tea, but what you can say is they're fundamentally inoffensive songs. He's singing songs like Our God is an Awesome God at a church to people who voluntarily show up because they like that sort of thing. An imam showing up and actually preaching hate against the Jews, no, not worthy of coverage. The only way that you can explain this is that a Muslim figure is left-coded because most Muslims vote for the Liberal Party, and Sean Foyt is right-coded because a lot of people who hold the kinds of pro-life, pro-family views he holds vote conservative. And therefore, the Canadian press, which is left-coded, will report on anybody, even sort of some long-haired evangelical hippie-type guy. He is a real threat. An imam preaching hatred, that is not a threat. And so part of the story here is, what do they see as a threat to the establishment and what do they not see as a threat to establishment? And it's their judgment call on these matters that has a lot of Jewish Canadians deciding to decamp to the United States personally. There's been a few stories on that recently in the National Post of people writing columns explaining why they're leaving Canada permanently. And so there's so many different cases that we've seen. Even I'm not going to get into a long list of these cases because I just wanted to make the point about the disparity in sentencing of people who are doing a peaceful protest in Ottawa. You might have hated the protest. You might have thought the Freedom Convoy was stupid, but it was a peaceful protest, regardless of your feelings of their views, regardless of what you think of Tamara Lich. Surely we can agree that somebody guilty of mischief, if she is indeed guilty of mischief, for a political protest, getting 7 years if the Crown prosecution gets their way, and a guy who mugs people with axes and murders young fathers, that guy gets the same sentencing request. And yet nobody's going to talk about the fact that a guy who planned to blow up a bunch of synagogues in Toronto, another crazy story, got house arrest. So what does the Canadian establishment think is a threat? What does the Canadian judiciary think is a threat? What does law enforcement think is a threat? And then what is actually a threat? That tells us a lot about the state of the country, and that's not very good news. Thank you all for listening to the Bridgehead Briefing this week. If you found this commentary helpful, please do like the video, share it across your platforms. You can download this podcast wherever you get your content. You can also drop a comment to join the conversation or suggest other topics you'd like to see us cover on the Bridgehead Briefing. Thank you so much for listening.